Hi, everyone. I'm Anne-Marie Green. Vladimir Duthier is going to be joining me in a moment. We want to begin this hour on Capitol Hill, where House Democrats have released the transcripts of some of the closed-door hearings. That includes former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, and former senior advisor to the Secretary of State, Ambassador Michael McKinley. Now, you may recall that that Ambassador Yovanovitch had testified that she felt like she had been pushed out of her position, though she's still a State Department employee. She testified in front of the inquiry against the directive of the White House. And as for McKinley, he said that he had quit his job because he was uncomfortable with what he was seeing in Ukraine. So there we have just some file video of Yovanovitch as she's heading in. So what we've received right now is the transcript, but also some sort of highlights of what both of these people had to say in front of the committee. We're just getting it right now, and I'm kind of perusing what we can see right here. Looking at Ambassador Yovanovitch, she was asked about Rudy Giuliani's plans to target her. She felt like Rudy Giuliani was working to get rid of her. She was asked, when did you first become aware that Rudy Giuliani had an interest in or was communicating with anyone in the Ukraine? She says probably about December 2018. And the question was, describe those circumstances when you first learned about it. And she says basically it was people in the Ukrainian government who said that Mr. Lysenko, the former prosecutor general, was in communications with Mayor Giuliani, and that they had plans and that they were going to, do things, including to me. Still vague. So you first heard about it from Ukrainian officials, and she says that's correct. It goes on to sort of highlight some of the other things that she had heard about Mr. Lysenko spreading falsehoods about her, and other highlights. So we have Nancy Cordes on the phone right now joining us, our congressional correspondent. Nancy, I'm just kind of looking at the highlights of Yovanovitch's testimony and trying to kind of like keep the ball in the air, as you might say. But have you gotten a chance to sort of take a look at the highlights of the transcript?
Still going through them, Anne-Marie, but, she goes into a great deal of detail, it appears, about everything that led up to her recall to Washington, everything that she was told and everything that she wasn't told about why she was suddenly sent home months early. Remember that Marie Yovanovitch basically was never given an official reason for why the president had lost confidence in her. And the State Department never put out any kind of statement of support for her. And so she talks about the fact that she was aware that she had basically been seen as sort of a fall person, if you will, for some of these corrupt Ukrainians who thought that they might have more leeway to do the things they wanted to do in Ukraine if the U.S. were to have a different policy in Ukraine, perhaps not as focused on corruption. But she said that she never really knew why she was being sent home. And as I'm sort of combing through this, the summaries, looks like she was also somewhat concerned for her safety and well-being because she had been told by Ukrainians to watch her back. And, she heard the president, well, she didn't hear him, but read the president say in that call summary from the July phone call that the president had with the president of Ukraine that she's going to go through some things. And Yovanovitch says that, she was a little worried about what he meant by that. We've never really gotten a good explanation from the White House for what the president meant by that.
And I'm reading how, she is questioned about her concerns about the activities, Rudy Giuliani's activities in Ukraine, and whether or not she tried to alert senior State Department officials. And she said she did, officials with the European Bureau, and she names a few people, George Canfield Reeker, and she says that they appeared to be concerned about what Rudy Giuliani was doing in Ukraine as well. But then ultimately, it seems like nothing was done about it.
Right. Nothing was done. And, what'll be interesting to see is there's another deposition transcript that's been released today as well. And this one's from Michael McKinley, who was a top aide handpicked to Mike Pompeo. And in it, he describes the lengths that he and others went to try to get the department, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, to put out some kind of statement of support for Yovanovitch, because it was so demoralizing to some of the career diplomats at the State Department that she was basically sort of like left out there to dry by all of these events. And he talks about the fact that it just never happened. Now, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, has denied that he ever got a request to put out a statement of support for her, but you have now multiple witnesses saying that they did, that they were concerned that she was basically hung out there to dry. Interestingly, another thing that Yovanovitch talks about in this testimony is the fact that Gordon Sondland, who has come up again and again because he's the U.S. ambassador to the EU, that she talked about all this with him at some point while she was still on the job. She knew that there were articles that were being placed back home against her. She knew that Rudy Giuliani was talking about her on Fox News and elsewhere, and she asked Sondland what she should do about it, and she says that he told her essentially, go big or go home. You need to tweet that you support the president and that everything out there is a lie and everything else. And she said that she didn't feel comfortable taking that approach as an ambassador. Interesting to read that she had gone directly to Sondland for his advice, because when he testified, our understanding is, and we haven't seen the transcripts of his deposition yet, but our understanding is that he said that he didn't really know why Yovanovitch had been recalled, which always seemed a bit strange since he essentially took over part of her portfolio. Seems sort of hard to believe that he would have no idea why she had been recalled early.
Yeah, and she talks a little bit in here about, what she sort of sees as a campaign to discredit her. She talks about an article in The Hill in March of 2019 that discredited her, and, talking to senior State Department officials who understood the content of that article from The Hill to be a fabrication and outrageous. They agreed with her. But then later on, she is warned that, no one from the State Department will issue a statement supporting her because they're afraid that the, quote, rug would be pulled out from under the State Department by the president.
Right, and it does appear that at a certain point, based on her testimony, the State Department decided that that standing by her might actually make things worse rather than better, and she was given the indication that perhaps she would become more of a target if the State Department decided to stick up for her, because it would put the State Department at odds with the president. I'm sure none of this was a comfort to her. And based on the testimony that we know of from all the other diplomatic individuals who have gone behind closed doors, she's someone who was very highly regarded. She didn't have any blemishes in her record. She had been doing this for a very long time. She was a very straight arrow. If you watch videos of her from her time in Ukraine, she certainly comes across that way. So the fact that she was somehow, targeted by, first and foremost, the president's attorney, personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, who, after all, didn't really even have a diplomatic role, but was out there saying that she was standing in the way of this Biden investigation, must have been troubling, not just to her, but, you can imagine to diplomats across the government who were watching from their posts around the world and seeing that as someone who they respected and someone who they thought was a real straight arrow was somehow being drummed out, not by accusations of actual malfeasance or poor behavior, but just because she was standing in the way of a political agenda that was being pursued by the president's personal attorney.
Yeah, Nancy, it's Vlad. And, on page 129 of this testimony, sort of feels like the icing on the cake, if you want to call it that, is that she's told that Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, quote, was no longer able to protect her from President Trump. So to your point, Nancy, about career Foreign Service officers who are not political appointees. Sometimes folks may think that diplomats, ambassadors are political appointees. Many of them rise up the ranks, starting out as, young, fresh-faced college graduates who rise up the ranks through the State Department, who get the less glamorous posts as ambassadors to countries representing the United States. And here you have the man at the top of the State Department unable to protect her when she's absolutely done nothing wrong. How demoralizing that would be to all career Foreign Service officers working on behalf of the United States for the American people.
Sure, especially because, as she testified, she never directed or suggested that any government official in Ukraine should refrain from investigating or prosecuting actual corruption. So even as you have the president's personal attorney making this case in the press that somehow she's standing in the way of an investigation into Joe Biden or into his son Hunter Biden and the company that Hunter Biden worked for, this Ukrainian oil and gas company Burisma, that she said no. Anytime there was actual corruption, she was all for investigating it. In fact, it was one of her key responsibilities in Ukraine was to try to help the Ukrainians crack down on corruption. But the clear inference there is that she didn't believe that this crusade against the Bidens was legitimate corruption, and so it's not something that she would have been pursuing.
So, Nancy, I know you have to go because we are expecting to hear from Adam Schiff shortly, and I know you want to get into place. Thank you so much for sort of jumping into this as it was unfolding. We really appreciate it.
You got it.
So now it'll be interesting to hear what Adam Schiff has to say. Also, I was noting that we were running actual pages of the transcript on our screens here, and you could just see, again, I want to point out that there were Republicans that were in these hearings, and their names were at the bottom of the screen. Those very same Republicans who get in front of the cameras and say Republicans are being shut out of the proceedings, like Lee Zeldin, like Jim Jordan, they are the ones who were witnessing this testimony from Marie Yovanovitch. And to the point that we were just making, Anne-Marie, which is as you go through this, you could see that there is some kind of an agenda, and it's not very clear yet, that Rudy Giuliani had, that he was conducting, some kind of agenda that he was working on behalf of the President of the United States. And they saw Ambassador Yovanovitch as standing in their way. It had nothing to do with anything she'd done wrong or anything that she, hadn't done properly. It all had to do with whatever it is that Rudy was working on.
So what we have in front of us, so the audience knows, are just sort of highlights, excerpts from their deposition, their testimony. The actual transcript has been released, and we're sort of working on getting that into our hands. And so when you look at the highlights, when it comes to Ambassador Yovanovitch, what you get really is that she's aware of the fact that there's some sort of campaign to discredit her. She doesn't seem to know why it's happening, and she doesn't seem to understand why State Department officials are not backing her up, though they seem to agree with her that something's going on. And then the other sort of testimony that has been released is that of Ambassador Michael McKinley. He's a former senior advisor to the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and he says sort of the first sort of portion that we get to see, he says that he resigned because of his concerns over the engagement of, this is a quote, over the engagement of our missions to procure negative political information for domestic purposes. And he said he resigned for that. And then when you read on with his testimony, he talks about trying to defend Ambassador Yovanovitch and sort of getting nowhere with that.
Yeah, and the question, of course, becomes, as you note, that there is the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, Yuri Lusenko. He's mentioned here in that Rudy Giuliani met with Lusenko, and for whatever reason, that's the thing I'm trying to figure out here. What was it about her that had them spreading, Mr. Lusenko, falsehoods? As according to page 32 and 34 of this document, Mr. Lusenko began spreading falsehoods about Ambassador Yovanovitch after she continued to press for reforms at his office that he failed to implement. So on one hand, the president and his supporters are arguing that the president of the United States was looking to root out corruption in Ukraine. Here you have the ambassador, a career Foreign Service officer, who is looking to do the same, and she's being stymied and stonewalled and then being badmouthed in the press.
So that's what she's testifying.
That's what she testifies.
In fact, she was doing the work that the president says that he was pursuing, which is an anti-corruption agenda.
So it's interesting too that as we start to see the release of these transcripts, and this is not the first that we're going to get. We knew that we were going to be getting some, but you can expect that as Adam Schiff releases these transcripts, there are going to be a lot more bombshells like this, where all of a sudden, the information that members of Congress were privy to, that it was easy to spin in front of the cameras about what this person said or what this person didn't say, or, listening to the conversation, you'll hear some Republicans saying, I didn't hear anything that was, wrong. Well, just the very idea that an ambassador to the United States, to save their jobs, has to tweet a tweet of loyalty to President Trump is troubling, to say the very least.
Yeah. So just reading a little bit more, in February of 2019, after communicating with Rudy Giuliani about Vice President Biden and the 2016 election, Ukrainian Minister of the Interior, his name is Arsen Avakov, expressed concerns to Ambassador Yovanovitch about getting into U.S. politics. So the question to her was, what were his concerns? And she says he thought it was dangerous, very dangerous, that Ukraine, since its independence, has had bipartisan support from both Democrats and Republicans all these years, and that to start kind of getting into U.S. politics and into U.S. domestic politics was a dangerous place for Ukraine to be. And we've seen that with some other testimony as well. There was a concern now, Vlad, I can't remember. I got to write a list of all the people who have testified. But there was a concern that that Ukraine had the support of Congress in terms of, obviously, this money to boost up their military, right? And that if they started to appear to be taking sides within domestic politics, they would lose the support of Democrats.
Right. Yeah, the Ukrainians rely on support from the United States because they are essentially fighting an encroaching Russia, an encroaching Vladimir Putin. So the idea that they would be partisan to Democrats or Republicans would be bad for them, because it's hard for them to predict who's going to be holding the purse strings, whether it's a democratically controlled Congress or a Republican-controlled Congress, and who's actually sitting in the Oval Office over the years. It's not a short-term game for the Ukrainians. It's a long-term game. Yeah. So they can't be privy or they can't be held to being partisan with one political party or another. So the idea that this would somehow encroach upon that is what Ambassador Yovanovitch is testifying here. She saw it as problematic.
And, we should remind people that Ukraine, this was sort of more than just sort of maintaining a friendly relationship with the United States. Ukraine desperately needs this money. Right. They are trying to stave off Russian encroachment. Russia, and they're essentially still fighting a war in sort of on the edges of Crimea around there. Right. So this was sort of life and death, not just about the money, but also showing Russia that the new Ukrainian prime president has the backing of America. Right. And so it wasn't just about the money. It was also about that really important meeting that he wanted to have, a public meeting that the President Zelensky wanted to have with the President of the United States to say, listen, we're not alone in this. We've got an important supporter.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, I sort of can't. These Foreign Service officers serve under Democratic presidents and under Republican presidents. And it doesn't actually matter how they vote. It just matters that they do their jobs, and they do their jobs, and they represent the interests of the United States in their posts at all levels of the Foreign Service that they undertake. And so you could see where, you would have surrogates for the President of the United States arguing that this individual, the ambassador, was perhaps not a Trump fan, or perhaps not even a supporter of President Trump, which would not matter in the least in the job that she was doing. Now, the president can certainly say, look, I want people that are on my team, but that's never been a requirement for being a Foreign Service officer. So this is why you're getting into this, these questions that become sort of strange when you're asked to tweet is a way to save your job.
Right. And the thing about Yovanovitch, and we've heard that she served under President Obama and all this sort of thing, is that she was actually asked to extend her time there. So she expected to be staying. And then suddenly she was sort of yanked out of there. And what we have with at least these two, the release of these two transcripts, these two people who testified, is a focus on what was happening in Ukraine, why she was being targeted. So she's talking about she understands that she was being targeted because she says she was doing anti-corruption work. She says that anti-corruption work brought her to question what Rudy Giuliani was doing in Ukraine. And then Michael McKinley is essentially backing her up, verifying that he did see that there was a campaign to discredit her, that it certainly seemed like members of the State Department were not coming to her defense. And even he was confused and troubled so much by it that he left. So that's sort of one area of this. And then the other area is what we saw with Alexander Vindman, right? And I don't know if they're going to release any of his testimony. He was on the phone call. So that's what's happening sort of here in the U.S. and the interaction between the president and the president of Ukraine.
All right. So let's bring in CBSN political contributor and White House correspondent for the Associated Press, Zeke Miller. He is joining us on the telephone to break this down for us. So, Zeke, we knew these were coming, and we knew that there was going to be some fresh information in these transcripts that we had not heard before, some very specific information. And of course, I know it's been just a few minutes, and you probably do not yet have a response from the White House, but just take this all in for our viewers and tell us what you're hearing.
Yeah, right now, as you said, this is still very new. We don't have an initial response here from the White House, but it is notable throughout this entire process that the president has tried to direct all of this conversation to the phone call and purely to that partial transcript of his conversations with the Ukrainian president, and has tried to sort of sidestep this entire separate question of Rudy Giuliani essentially running a shadow American foreign policy towards Ukraine, and that's really at the heart of what comes out in these depositions, and you can review now in these transcripts that were just released just a few minutes ago. Sort of vivid account of Giuliani's efforts to sort of try to undermine the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, and to that perspective on the view of sort of the official U.S. Representative's sort of viewpoint on the unofficial representative of the president's efforts to try to sort of interfere and change U.S. policy towards Ukraine. It is sort of astonishing to read sort of all of this laid out the way it is. We're still obviously going through it, but it is one of those things that we have not heard the White House really discuss that issue substantively. The president started trying to deflect onto the issue of the phone call, but there's a lot more than the phone call here that truly is in these transcripts.
Zeke, the press statement from the committees that are releasing these testimonies and these transcripts says this. I'm going to quote from it. The transcript of interviews with Ambassadors Yovanovitch and McKinley demonstrate clearly how President Trump approved the removal of a highly respected and effective diplomat based on public falsehoods and smears against Ambassador Yovanovitch's character and her work in support of long-held U.S. foreign policy anti-corruption goals. It just sort of is striking that the entire time the White House and the president's surrogates have been saying there's nothing wrong here, when something like this seems pretty wrong.
Yeah, you'd be hard pressed to find a specific criminal statute that this would violate, but that's in a way besides the point here, and sort of it represents a little bit of the moving of the goalposts. This is an effort by the president's personal attorney to essentially undermine the credibility of a lifelong public servant who represents this entire country and has done so faithfully for decades, essentially, to a foreign government at the behest at times of foreign officials. That is a striking statement in and of itself, and sort of fact pattern in and of itself, and you might not be able to sort of make that a criminal case, but sort of from a standpoint of sort of how the norms in Washington have shifted and eroded in this time frame, sort of is sort of the latest data point towards that, and is sort of also worth noting, one of the things that impeachment is a political process, not a legal one. High crimes and misdemeanors is the sort of thing that are left up to lawmakers on Capitol Hill to define. This is the sort of thing that if they want to, they can do that.